North Korea's transformation into capitalism is too easy. It's over once the supreme leader makes a decision. Episode 7. North Korea's first step towards state capitalism. Creating the miracle on the Taedong River. North Korea's Workers' Party can implement a market economy. North Korea is a country that can very easily transition to capitalism. Once the supreme leader makes a decision, the process can proceed swiftly. The groundwork for accepting capitalism has already been laid. It is precisely because the attraction to capitalism is so strong that they are strictly suppressing it. Conscious of South Korea, they are imposing harsh punishments, even resorting to the death penalty to block illusions and solidify regime cohesion. However, underlying this oversensitive policy is the rapid spread of capitalism. However, the North Korean leadership needs to reconsider this carefully. They need to ask whether vague fears stemming from vague preconceptions and speculations regarding the actual impact on the regime when dealing with the outside world, including South Korea, are hindering their progressive and rational thinking. If you break down and examine the facts one by one, you will see the truth behind each, and when you gather all those truths, the overall picture emerges. Inductive consideration, not deductive reasoning, is required. If you draw conclusions from the apex, such as claiming it violates socialism or contradicts the monolithic ideological system, you cannot look down to the lower levels. In a system where people are bound by ideological frameworks and unable to even dare to think differently, shouldn't the leadership, as those responsible for the fate of not only themselves but also the country and the people, keep their horizons of thought wide open and look far ahead? Of course, they are doing so, but circumstances may not always allow it. By breaking free from the framework of dogmatic thinking and adopting a pragmatic attitude to examine the discrepancies between what is desired and reality point by point, and by making adjustments that sometimes reflect reality and sometimes align with what is desired, better solutions suited to the objectives will become visible. In North Korea, the foremost principle that cannot be touched is upholding the system of the supreme leader's monolithic leadership. Good. However, maintaining the monolithic system is actually unrelated to socialism. The monolithic system and capitalism are not in opposition. The opposing concept is democracy, not capitalism. Socialism does not presuppose a monolithic system, nor does that system necessarily have to be socialism. It is merely an inherited legacy. If the system and the country are facing difficulties due to socialist ideology, we must reconsider. Although socialism has failed, that does not mean it lacks merit. While it is true that capitalism is a fundamental system that is certainly advantageous for economic development, it also carries its own problems. In that case, how about we select and combine what North Korea needs? What North Korea needs is the maintenance of the monolithic system and the resolution of economic problems. Setting such a broad objective as system maintenance yields no solution. That is why they have been trapped in a dilemma where wanting one thing makes another a problem, and they have been unable to escape it until now. The system simply refers to an existing structure, and the content of that system is more important. Because the system was confined within an established ideological framework, the concrete and substantive contents within it became invisible. No, they could not see them, nor did they even think to look at them. However, upon closer examination, a monolithic system and economic development are not in conflict. Rather, they can generate powerful synergy simply by changing one's mindset. This is possible merely by rethinking socialism and capitalism. We simply need to preserve the strengths of socialism while discarding its weaknesses. We can then fill that void with capitalism, which we had previously rejected without question. However, since the advantage of capitalism lies in naturally providing economic actors with fundamental motives and a basic space for activity in accordance with human nature, the foundation of the economic system must be transformed into capitalism. The advantage of socialism lies in the state taking the lead in areas such as comprehensive planning, wealth distribution, and public welfare, which are necessary for the superstructure of the national economic system. Combining these two strengths results in state capitalism. The path for North Korea toward state capitalism is surprisingly easy. All it takes is to acknowledge capitalism. At the very least, it requires a decision to accept its advantages. It is not about abandoning socialism, but rather combining it with capitalism to transform into a more vibrant economic system. Now, however, a concern arises what to do about the liberal ideologies that will flow in with the opening to capitalism. North Korea's current political system is sufficient to block such winds. In fact, the problem is that they are overflowing. Moreover, China and Vietnam have succeeded without major issues. We must not make the mistake of being afraid of maggots and therefore unable to make kimchi. Furthermore, the North Korean people can be sufficiently persuaded, and they will endure and accept it. Once they are immediately freed from hunger, shake off poverty, and begin to become wealthy, they will prefer orderly growth over freedom that leads to nothing. Therefore, the first thing the Pyongyang leadership must do is acknowledge and accept capitalism. And they must start by reforming their legal system accordingly. They must demonstrate it through actions, not words. Starting with the Constitution, the judicial system, including civil and criminal laws, must be reformed to align with international norms that recognize and protect private property. In adopting capitalism, the key lies in reforming the legal system to establish legal and institutional safeguards for property relations, such as private property, free from political interference. Only then will everyone trust the system, invest, work diligently, and become guardians of the regime. Once the capitalist system is adopted in this way, everything will proceed smoothly. In particular, relations with the outside world will shift from hostile to friendly, mutually beneficial ones. All nations will welcome this. At this point, North Korea can enter the process of establishing diplomatic relations with the United States. It will be possible to engage in package negotiations by placing key agenda items such as diplomatic relations with the U.S., denuclearization, economic compensation and support, and a permanent security guarantee system all on the table. To prevent China or Russia from being sidelined and opposing the move, there is also a proposal to form a consultative body among the 4 surrounding nations, the United States, China, Japan, and Russia, to jointly guarantee North Korea's permanent neutrality and security. Of course, it would be good if South Korea provided support, but there is a prerequisite: the legal recognition of the existence of both nations. Once the U.S. Embassy is established in Pyongyang, external funds and businesses will follow. North Korea must also redefine its relationship with South Korea to adapt to the changed environment. While there is much work to be done for North Korea to settle the past with South Korea and move toward future-oriented exchanges, at least 2 things must be done. First, they must acknowledge the invasion of the South during the Korean War and apologize on behalf of their predecessors. This is a crucial political act, as well as a humanitarian one. Only by releasing the deep-seated resentment can genuine sincerity to reconcile and acknowledge one another emerge. The other task is the dismantling of political prisoner camps. In fact, the Pyongyang leadership is well aware that political prisoner camps are the biggest issue tarnishing the image of the North Korean regime. However, such camps are actually unnecessary for maintaining the regime. They are an excessive and inhumane legacy of the past that must now be liquidated. China and Vietnam maintain themselves well without such camps, and they are sufficiently managed through punishments within the legal framework alone. If these 2 measures are implemented, the North Korean regime will succeed in a definite image transformation alongside the introduction of capitalism. The resulting goodwill and trust will manifest as a massive influx of money, people, and resources. A renewed North Korea takes its first step toward the miracle on the Taedong River that will be remembered in history. Now, the Pyongyang leadership begins a confident race toward the world. Starting next time, we will examine, one by one, the tasks of legal and institutional reform that will serve as the soil for a capitalist market economy to take root in North Korea. Thank you.